Hey there. Tonight, we journey to a different time and a different world. We leave behind the familiar histories of kings and empires, of skyscrapers and digital streams, and we travel back to the vast, windswept grasslands of the North American plains, to a time before the horizon was scarred by fences and telephone poles. We are going to live for a time within a Native American clan, among the peoples of the Great Plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, the Crow. Forget the romantic or simplistic images of a primitive life, the one-dimensional caricatures painted by old movies and dusty textbooks. We are stepping into a civilization that was deeply complex, profoundly spiritual, and ingeniously adapted to one of the most demanding and beautiful landscapes on Earth. This is not a story of great wars or dramatic conquests, though those certainly happened. This is a story of the quiet, rhythmic, and deeply meaningful tasks that made up a life. It's about the feel of a freshly scraped bison hide, stretched taut on a frame, the sound of the ceaseless prairie wind singing through the poles of a tipi, the taste of roasted meat and wild turnips cooked over a buffalo chip fire, and the sight of a billion stars in a sky so dark and clear it felt like you could fall right into it. It's about understanding a world where the sacred and the mundane were not separate things, but were woven together into a single, intricate tapestry of existence. If this kind of slow, detailed, and contemplative history helps you to quiet your mind and find a measure of peace, I would be grateful if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if these stories genuinely bring you some rest. And as always, I love to see our community of listeners. Please, feel free to leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. There's a unique comfort in knowing we are all settling in together, from all corners of the globe. So, dim your lights. Turn on a fan for that soft, ambient hum if you find it soothing. Get comfortable, find that perfect spot in your bed, and let's step through a doorway in time, into the heart of the great green ocean of grass, and into a life that was governed by the sun, the seasons, and the thundering herds of the bison. Let's get this out of the way first. To understand life in a plains clan, you have to perform a bit of mental gymnastics. You need to uninstall the default operating system that runs in most of our modern heads, the one that neatly categorizes the world into living things and inanimate objects. For the people of the plains, that distinction was, to put it mildly, nonsense. In their reality, the universe wasn't a collection of resources, it was a community of persons. In their world, pretty much everything was alive. Not in a cute, poetic, the hills are alive kind of way. No, it was more fundamental, more real. The rocks were alive. The wind was alive. The rivers, the mountains, the thunder, the sun, they were all persons. They weren't like people, they were people, just a different kind of people. They had motivations, personalities, moods and agency. They could help you, harm you, or ignore you completely, just like your relatives. The rustle of leaves wasn't just wind, it was a conversation. A sudden chill wasn't just a drop in temperature, it was a presence passing by. And that's the key word, relatives. The core of the plains worldview wasn't just that the world was alive, it was that you were related to all of it. The Lakota phrase for this is mitakuye oyaz ing, which roughly translates to all my relations, or we are all related. This wasn't a bumper sticker slogan, it was the foundational, load-bearing pillar of their entire reality. It meant that your relationship with a thunderstorm wasn't one of a human versus a weather phenomenon. It was one of a person dealing with a powerful, unpredictable, and potentially grumpy great uncle. You showed it respect. You made offerings. You paid attention to its warnings. You tried not to annoy it. Think of it this way. In our modern world, if you want something, you generally take it. You see a resource, you extract it. It's a transaction with an object. In the plains world, if you needed something, say, a cottonwood tree's branches for the Sundance ceremony, you didn't just go chop them off. You approached the tree as a relative. You explained what you needed and why, perhaps speaking aloud your intentions. You offered a gift, a small pouch of tobacco, a pinch of sacred herbs. You were entering into a reciprocal relationship, not performing a resource extraction. It was less like going to a lumberyard and more like asking your grandfather if you could borrow his car. You had to ask nicely, state your intentions and show gratitude. To do otherwise was to commit an act of disrespect, an act of violence against a member of your own extended family, and you could be sure that such disrespect would have consequences down the line. This animating force, this spiritual energy that coursed through everything, was often referred to as Wakan Tanka by the Lakota, or a similar concept by other tribes. It's often translated as the Great Spirit, but that's a bit of a clumsy, monolithic oversimplification that sounds suspiciously like a translation made for Christian missionaries. A more accurate translation is the Great Mystery, or the Great Sacred. It wasn't a single bearded old man in the sky. Wakantanka was the sum total of all the spirits, all the powers, all the life forces of the universe, both seen and unseen. It was the thunder, the rock, the bison, the spider, the sun, and the wind, all at once. It was everything, and it was in everything. It was less a being and more a quality, a state of sacredness and power that could manifest anywhere, in anything, at any time. So, when a man or woman went out on a vision quest, humble cap, or crying for a dream, they weren't just meditating or finding themselves. They were deliberately making themselves humble and pitiable in order to attract the attention of one of these other than human persons. A spirit, a bison, an eagle, the wind. A stone might take pity on this crying, fasting human and grant them a vision. This vision wasn't a hallucination. It was a direct impartation of knowledge and power from one relative to another. The spirit might teach the person a song, give them instructions for a sacred bundle, reveal a healing practice, or grant them a new name. That power, or wakan, was then a part of them. It guided their life, protected them, and helped define their unique role in the community. Their personal power was a gift, a loan from the universe, and it came with responsibilities. This worldview had profound practical implications. It meant you didn't see yourself as master of the landscape. You were just one small, not particularly important part of a vast and interconnected family. This fostered a deep, instinctual form of environmentalism that wasn't born from abstract scientific principles, but from the lived reality of kinship. You don't pollute your own home or poison your own family members. When you took the life of a bison, it was a sacred act. You were taking the life of a relative who was offering itself so that you, another relative, could live. You offered thanks through prayer and ceremony. You used every single part of its body, not out of a thrifty, waste not, want not mentality, but out of profound respect for the sacrifice that had been made. To waste any part of the bison was a deep insult to its spirit and to the cosmic balance of things. It was like spitting on a grave. Living on the plains meant living in a world that was perpetually talking to you. The cry of an eagle, the direction of the wind, the pattern of stars, the behavior of a coyote weren't random occurrences. They were communications. They were news bulletins from the wider family. Even the lowly spider, Iktomai, was a teacher, a trickster figure whose stories taught valuable lessons about foolishness and wisdom. Your job was to learn how to listen, how to understand the language of the rustling grass and the circling hawk, and how to reply with the appropriate respect and humility. It was a world that demanded constant awareness and participation. You couldn't just tune it out. You were in a lifelong conversation with the universe itself. If you think modern family gatherings are complicated, just wait until you get a load of the Plains kinship system. It was a social architecture so intricate and so powerful that it made everything else law, politics, economics possible. Let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't some loosey-goosey collection of people wandering the prairie. This was a society with rules, and the first and most important rule was, know who you're related to and how you're supposed to act around them. First, let's clear up some terminology. The words tribe, band, and clan get thrown around a lot, often interchangeably. In reality, they represented different levels of a very fluid social organization. The tribe or nation was the largest group, think of it, as everyone who spoke the same language and shared a common culture and identity, like the Cheyenne or the Arapaho. But you rarely interacted with the entire tribe at once. It was too big, like trying to have a potluck with everyone from the state of Nebraska. The tribe gathered for major ceremonies, like the sun dance, but for most of the year it was dispersed. The primary unit of daily life was the band, Tiospai in Lakota. A band was a smaller, multi-family group, usually ranging from a few dozen to a few hundred people who camped and traveled together. Think of it less like a rigid, official town and more like a massive, sprawling group chat that people could join or leave. Bands were often named after a leader or a significant event. If a leader was a particularly good hunter, a wise statesman, or just a charismatic guy, people would gravitate towards him and his band would grow. If he made a series of bad decisions or a disastrous hunt, picked a fight with a more powerful neighbor, or consistently chose terrible campsites, families might just pack up their tipi and go join another, more successful band. Loyalty was important, but practicality was paramount. This internal flexibility was a key survival trait, allowing people to shift alliances and resources as needed in a constantly changing environment. Within the band, the fundamental building block was the extended family, or the clan. And this is where it gets really interesting. Kinship wasn't just about your direct blood relatives. The system was so expansive that practically everyone in the band was considered a relative in some way, and your relationship to them came with a very specific instruction manual for behavior. For example, your father's brothers weren't your uncles. They were also your fathers. Their children weren't your cousins. They were your brothers and sisters. The same went for your mother's sisters. They were all your mothers, and their kids were your siblings. This wasn't just a symbolic title. It came with real responsibilities. Any of your fathers could discipline you, teach you, and were expected to provide for you. Any of your mothers could nurture you and guide you. This created an incredibly resilient social safety net. If your biological parents died, you weren't an orphan. You simply had a dozen other parents ready to step in without a second thought. Your world didn't collapse. The support structure was already built in. This system also dictated who you couldn't marry. With so many people classified as your brother or sister, the pool of eligible partners within your own band could be quite small, forcing you to look for a spouse in other bands and fostering interband alliances. But kinship terms also defined your expected behavior. You had joking relatives and respect relatives. Your brothers, in-law and sisters, in-law were often joking relatives. With them, you could engage in teasing, pranks, and even ribald humor. This acted as a social pressure valve, allowing for a casual and friendly relationship with your in-laws. On the other hand, you had to show profound respect to your parents, your aunts and uncles, who were also your parents, and your grandparents. The real masterpiece of social engineering was the avoidance relationship, particularly the one between a man and his mother-in-law. This wasn't a stand-up comedy trope. It was a deadly serious social rule. A man and his wife's mother were forbidden from speaking to each other, looking at each other, or even being in the same tipi at the same time if they could help it. If they absolutely had to communicate, they would do so through a third party. Please tell my mother-in-law that her daughter is a fine cook. A man might say to his wife, while the mother-in-law was standing 10 feet away, pretending to be intensely interested in a patch of dirt. Now, before you assume this was just a weirdly formal way of preventing family arguments over the holidays, think about its function. In a small, close-knit community where a young couple often lived with or near the wife's family, this rule was a brilliant piece of social lubrication. It prevented the natural friction and potential conflicts of interest that can arise between a husband and his wife's family. By creating a mandatory wall of formal, respectful distance, it short-circuited arguments before they could even begin. It preserved household harmony by making casual conflict impossible. The respect was built into the grammar of their daily lives. A similar, though often less strict, avoidance was practiced between a woman and her father-in-law. Beyond the family, men's societies played a huge role. These were like fraternities or clubs, with their own songs, dances, regalia, and responsibilities. Some were warrior societies, like the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers or the Lakota Kit Foxes. These men were the bravest of the brave, often taking vows to be the first to charge and the last to retreat. Others were spiritual or social societies. These groups provided another layer of identity and belonging outside of the kinship system and often served as the Akishita, or camp police, during the communal bison hunt, ensuring no one broke ranks and scared the herd prematurely. So, while from the outside, a plains camp might look like a simple collection of families, it was actually a complex and finely tuned social machine. Every individual was a node in a vast network of relationships, each with its own specific protocol, purpose, and set of responsibilities. This intricate web of kinship was what held the society together. It was the source of its strength, its resilience, and its ability to thrive for centuries in a world that demanded cooperation above all else. If you think modern tiny homes are an innovation, you need to have a serious talk about the tipi. The iconic dwelling of the Plains peoples was far more than just a pointy tent. It was a marvel of physics, a spiritual sanctuary, a family's resume, and a piece of high-tech portable architecture that your fancy mountaineering tent can only dream of being. Let's not kid ourselves. The tipi was the perfect architectural solution for a semi-nomadic lifestyle centered on following the bison herds. Constructing a stationary log cabin or an earth lodge on the open plains would be like building a battleship in a bathtub. Immobile, impractical, and a terrible use of limited resources. The tipi, on the other hand, was the ultimate mobile home, capable of being taken down or put up in under an hour by a skilled team of women. And yes, let's get that straight right now. The tipi belonged to the woman of the household. It was her property, her domain. She was the engineer, the construction crew, and the CEO of the home. A man might own his horse and his weapons, but he was essentially a long-term guest in his wife's house. If a marriage went south, it wasn't the woman who had to pack her bags. It was the man. She could literally put his belongings outside the door, the plain's equivalent of changing the locks and the Netflix password. He was out. The tipi, and everything in it, stayed with her. Now, for the design itself. A tipi wasn't just a simple cone which would turn into a smoke-filled nightmare the moment you lit a fire. It was a tilted cone. The back was steeper, and the front was more gently sloped, creating a brilliant aerodynamic profile that could withstand the ferocious, ever-present winds of the prairie. The poles weren't arranged in a perfect circle. They formed an egg-shaped footprint. This clever design created more headroom at the back of the tipi, where people sat and slept, and a more convenient space for the fire up front, closer to the door. The real genius, however, was in the climate control system. At the top of the tipi were two large flaps, or ears, each controlled by a long external pole. These weren't just for decoration. They were an ingenious ventilation system. By adjusting the position of these flaps, you could create a draft that would pull smoke from the central fire straight up and out of the smoke hole, regardless of which direction the wind was blowing. On a hot summer day, you could roll up the entire bottom edge of the tipi cover, allowing a cool breeze to flow through the shaded interior. In the depths of a brutal plains winter, an inner lining of painted skins, called a dewcloth or ozone, would be hung around the inside wall. This created a pocket of insulating air between the two layers, much like a modern double-paned window. It also prevented condensation from dripping on the occupants and directed any rainwater that might sneak through the smoke hole to run harmlessly down between the layers to the ground. Add a small, well-tended fire in the center, and a tipi could be a surprisingly cozy and comfortable shelter, even when a blizzard was raging outside. The tipi was also a canvas for a family's story and spiritual identity. Many tipis were decorated with painted designs that were far from random doodles. These paintings often depicted important events from the family's history, personal achievements in war or hunting, or powerful spirit beings from the owner's vision quests. A tipi's cover was a public declaration of the family's status, power, and sacred connections. You could read a tipi like a resume. Some designs were considered so powerful that they could only be owned by certain families and were passed down through generations. A Blackfoot tipi, for example, might be painted with a band of symbols around the bottom representing the earth, a central band with animal figures from the owner's vision, and a top band representing the sky. Inside, the tipi had its own social geography and etiquette. The place of honor was at the back, opposite the door. This was typically reserved for the male head of the household, or for an esteemed guest. The right side of the tipi, as you entered, was generally the man's side, where he kept his weapons, his sacred bundle, and other personal items. The left side was the woman's domain, where she kept her cooking utensils, hide-working tools, and food supplies. The floor was covered with soft furs, and comfortable backrests made of willow rods and supported by a tripod allowed people to recline comfortably. You didn't just plop down anywhere. You entered to the left, moved around the back of the fire, and took your designated spot. The door always faced east, toward the rising sun, greeting the new day with openness and prayer. Even the number of poles used was significant. A typical tipi might use 12 to 20 long, straight lodgepole pine poles, which were a valuable commodity in themselves, often acquired through trade or long journeys to the mountains. The foundation was built on a tripod of 3 or 4 primary poles, with the others laid into the V shape they formed at the top. The last pole to be placed was the lifting pole, which had the heavy, semicircular bison hide cover attached to it before it was raised into position. The whole structure was then wrapped, secured with wooden lacing pins up the front, and pegged to the ground. The tipi itself was seen as a representation of the cosmos. The floor was the earth, the walls were the sky, and the poles were the pathways connecting the earth to the spirit world. So, the tipi was not a primitive shack. It was a sophisticated, multifunctional, and deeply symbolic structure. It was a home, a sanctuary, a status symbol, and a piece of brilliant engineering, all rolled into one. It was a physical manifestation of the plains worldview, practical, portable, respectful of the elements, and perfectly adapted to a life lived in motion. If you have this romantic notion of plains life as an endless series of noble-looking men staring stoically at the sunset while women gracefully mill corn, you need to recalibrate. Life was work. Hard, relentless, and highly skilled work. But the concept of work was different. It wasn't a separate part of life you commuted to, it was life. And the division of labor between men and women wasn't a matter of one being superior or more important than the other. It was a partnership of specialists, a corporate merger where each department was absolutely critical for the survival of the enterprise. Let's start with the women, because the stereotype of the downtrodden, overworked squaw is one of the most persistent and insulting myths in American history. A woman's work wasn't housework in the modern sense. She was the industrial engine of the clan. She was the manufacturer, the chemist, the engineer, the architect, the supply chain manager, and the chief nutritionist. The entire domestic and economic stability of the family rested on her shoulders and her skills. Her primary job title could have been bison processor. When the men brought back a bison, their job was largely done. Her job was just beginning. She, along with the other women, would skin and butcher the massive animal with an efficiency that would make a modern butcher weep. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. The meat was eaten fresh or cut into thin strips and dried on racks in the sun to make jerky, or pounded with berries and rendered fat to create wasna, or pemmicanna high-energy superfood that was the original protein bar and could last for years. The hide was the real prize. Tanning a bison hide was a grueling, multi-step chemical and physical process. The woman would first stake the hide to the ground, flesh side up. Using a scraper, often made from a bison leg bone, she would meticulously remove all remaining flesh and fat. Then, she would flip it over, and with an adze-like tool, painstakingly scrape the hair off the other side. This was back-breaking work. Once scraped, the hide was treated with a tanning magenta paste made from the bison's own brains and liver, which are rich in fatty acids and lecithins that soften the hide. She would rub this mixture deep into the pores of the skin, then soak it in water, wring it out, and repeat. The final step was to stretch and pull the hide as it dried, often by pulling it back and forth over a taut rope or a smoothed log to make it soft and pliable. To create a waterproof smoked hide for a tipi cover or moccasins, it would then be suspended over a smouldering fire of rotted wood to be saturated with smoke. A single tipi cover required 12 to 20 of these massive, professionally tanned hides, all precisely cut and stitched together by the women. And that was just one job. Women were responsible for gathering all plant foods, wild turnips, berries, choke cherries, and medicinal plants. They cooked all the meals, often using a method where hot rocks were dropped into a water-filled bison paunch to create a boiling stew. They made all the clothing, decorating it with intricate and beautiful patterns of dyed porcupine quills or, later, glass beads acquired through trade. This wasn't just decoration, it was an art form of the highest order, a way of expressing beauty, status, and spiritual power. They fetched the water and the firewood, often dried bison chips, which were plentiful and burned hot and slow. They were responsible for setting up and taking down the tipi every time the camp moved. And of course they raised the children. A woman's value was directly tied to her skills and her industry. A hard-working, skilled woman who could tan a hide to buttery softness, create beautiful quill work, and manage her household efficiently was a woman of high status and immense respect. She was the anchor of the family. So what were the men doing while all this was going on? Staring at the sunset? Not exactly. A man's sphere of responsibility was external. He was the provider of the primary raw material protein and the head of security for the entire community. Hunting was a full-time, high-risk profession. Before the horse, it often involved communal drives, where a group of men would cleverly stampede a herd of bison over a cliff, a buffalo jump, or into a corral. This required immense coordination, courage, and a deep understanding of animal behavior. After the arrival of the horse in the 18th century, the hunt changed. Now, a single skilled hunter on a specially trained buffalo horse could ride directly into a thundering herd, select a prime cow, and take it down with a lance or well-aimed arrows. This was incredibly dangerous. A fall from a horse in the middle of a stampede was almost certain death. A man was also the protector. He was the soldier, the warrior, the security guard. The plains could be a dangerous place. Competition for resources, particularly horses and prime hunting grounds, could lead to raids and warfare between different tribes. A man was expected to be ready at a moment's notice to defend his camp from enemy raiders or to join a party to retaliate for a previous attack or to steal horses, which was both an economic necessity and a path to glory. Bravery in battle was one of the primary ways a man could gain status and respect. His war deeds were recounted in stories, painted on his tipi and his robes, and celebrated in songs. Beyond the high-stakes jobs of hunting and fighting, men were the primary toolmakers. They crafted their own bows from woods like ash or Osage orange, backing them with sinew for added power. They chipped arrowheads and spear points from stone. They made the wooden frames for saddles and the tough shields from the thickened neck hide of a bull bison. They were also the political representatives of their families. The men gathered in council to make decisions for the band, when and where to move camp, whether to go to war, how to negotiate with other groups. So, the division of labor was a pragmatic and balanced partnership. Women's work was centered on the internal, domestic sphere, transforming raw materials into usable goods and sustaining the home. Men's work was centered on the external, public sphere acquiring the raw materials and protecting the home. The two spheres were completely interdependent. A successful hunter was useless without a wife to process his kill. A skilled woman was vulnerable without a husband to provide for and protect her. It wasn't a hierarchy. It was a circle, a partnership essential for survival on the vast and demanding plains. To say the bison was important to the plains peoples is like saying air is important to breathing. It's a statement so obvious it borders on the absurd. The American bison wasn't just a source of food. It was the foundation of an entire civilization. It was the hardware store, the clothing outlet, the pharmacy, the cutlery shop, and the spiritual center of the universe, all wrapped up in a shaggy 2,000-pound package. The relationship between the people and the bison, or Tatanka, was one of profound physical and spiritual symbiosis. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine you're a plains family, and the hunters have just successfully brought down a large bull. Now, let's follow that bull through the factory of the camp and see what it becomes. First, the obvious, the meat. The average bison yielded hundreds of pounds of high-protein, low-fat meat. The choicest cuts the tongue, the liver, the heart, the fatty hump were often eaten raw right after the kill, a nutrient-rich reward for the hunters. The rest was brought back to camp. Some would be roasted for the immediate feast, but the vast majority was processed for long-term storage. Women would slice it into paper-thin sheets and hang it on wooden racks to dry in the sun and wind, creating jerky, papa. Or they would pound the dried meat into a powder, mix it with melted fat and sometimes crushed choke cherries or other berries, and pack it into rawhide containers. This was pemmican, wasna, a caloric powerhouse that could keep for years, and was the perfect portable food for journeys or lean times. Next, the hide. This was arguably the most valuable part after the meat. A thick winter hide from a bull was perfect for making winter robes, mittens, and bedding. The toughest part of the bull's hide, from the neck, was used to make war shields, which were so thick and tough when shrunk over a fire that they could deflect an arrow. Hides from cows, being thinner and more pliable, were the preferred material for tipi covers, clothing dresses, leggings, shirts, and moccasins. Scraped thin and de-haired but not tanned, the hide became stiff, translucent rawhide. This was the original plastic. It was used to make storage boxes, parfleches, drumheads, rattles, rope, and saddle coverings. You could even use it for cooking by digging a hole, lining it with the rawhide, filling it with water and meat, and dropping in hot stones. But we're just getting started. Let's look at the skeleton. The bones were a complete toolkit. The large leg bones could be cracked for their nutritious marrow and then sharpened into scrapers, awls for sewing, and fleshers for processing other hides. The porous shoulder blades, or scapulae, made excellent hoes for tending small gardens of corn or squash. Ribs could be used as runners for small sleds for children or for hauling goods. The skull, often with the horns still attached, was a powerful spiritual object. It was frequently used in ceremonies, most notably the sun dance, as a symbol of the bison spirit and a reminder of its sacrifice. The horns themselves were carved into cups, spoons, and ladles. They could also be used to carry hot coals from one campfire to the next when the camp moved. Shaved thin, they could become translucent, functioning almost like a window in some ceremonial objects. What about the inside bits? The stomach, or paunch, could be cleaned and used as a watertight cooking vessel or a water carrier. The bladder, when cleaned and inflated, made an excellent canteen. The intestines could be eaten or cleaned and used for sausage casings or waterproof containers. The long tendons from along the backbone were a source of sinew, the superglue and duct tape of the plains. Dried and shredded, sinew provided incredibly strong thread for sewing clothing and tipi covers, and for attaching feathers and points to arrows. When glued to the back of a wooden bow, it added immense power and resilience. Even the smaller, seemingly insignificant parts had a purpose. The beard could be used to decorate clothing and weapons. The tail made a perfect fly swatter. The hooves could be boiled down to make glue. The hair from the head and body was used as stuffing for pillows, cradle boards, and balls for games. It could also be braided into rope. And finally, what was left after all that? The dung. Dried bison chips were the primary fuel source on the largely treeless plains. They were plentiful, easy to gather, and burned with a hot, clean, and surprisingly odorless flame, making them perfect for cooking and heating the tipi. The bison gave everything. Its body was the physical sustenance of the people, and its spirit was their spiritual sustenance. The great herds were a direct, living connection to Wakan Tanka. The white buffalo calf woman, a central figure in Lakota spirituality, brought the sacred pipe to the people and taught them that the bison was their relative, a four-legged brother who would stand with them and provide for them. This is why the deliberate, systematic slaughter of the bison by white hunters in the late 19th century was not just an economic disaster for the Plains tribes, it was an act of profound spiritual warfare. It was an attempt to sever their connection to their world, to kill their god, to erase their identity. By destroying the bison, the newcomers were destroying the supermarket, the hardware store, and the cathedral, all at once. The entire world of the Plains people was built on the back of this magnificent animal, and without it, that world could not stand. If you think modern romance is a minefield of unspoken rules and awkward encounters, it had nothing on courtship and marriage on the Plains. It was a delicate dance of public reputation, family politics, and surprisingly, a good deal of personal choice. Forget rose petals and candlelight dinners. This was more like, your family has a lot of horses, my daughter is a master hide tanner, let's make a deal. But it was also more romantic than that sounds. Let's start with courtship. A young man didn't just walk up to a young woman and ask for her number. That kind of directness would have been shockingly rude. Instead, courtship was a game of subtle signals and public displays. One of the most common methods was for a young man to simply stand or sit near the young woman's tipi for hours on end, wrapped in his blanket, hoping she would notice him. This was the 19th century Plains version of orbiting someone's social media profile, a low-risk way to show interest without inviting outright rejection. If he was feeling bolder, he might try to speak with her when she went to fetch water from the stream, a rare moment when she might be away from the watchful eyes of her family. These conversations were often short, formal, and terrifying for the young man. The most romantic and well-known courtship ritual, however, was the courting flute. A young man would acquire or make a flute, often from cedar wood, and compose a personal melody. Under the cover of darkness, he would creep near his beloved's tipi and play his tune. This was his signature, his love song. If the young woman was interested, she might signal her approval by coming out to talk. If her father was interested in the match, he might invite the young man inside. And if her father was not interested, the suitor might get a bucket of cold water or a stern warning for his troubles. It was basically a high-stakes serenade. Another fascinating custom was blanket courtship. A young man, with the girl's implicit permission, would approach her in public, often during a dance or social gathering. He would hold open his blanket, and she would step inside with him. Wrapped together in the single blanket, they could speak privately in the middle of a crowd, their conversation shielded from prying ears. This was an accepted social convention, a little bubble of privacy in a world that had very little of it. What they talked about was their own business, but it was a clear public signal that they were officially talking. Now, once a couple decided they wanted to get married, the man didn't propose to the woman. He proposed to her family. Marriage wasn't just a union of two individuals, it was a formal alliance between two families. The young man, often accompanied by his father or a respected uncle, would approach the woman's family with gifts, primarily horses. This wasn't buying a wife, it was bride price, or more accurately, bride wealth. It was a gesture that demonstrated the young man's ability to provide, his respect for her family, and his acknowledgement of the value of the woman he wished to marry. He was compensating her family for the loss of a valuable and productive member. A wealthy or prestigious family might demand a large number of horses for their daughter's hand. If the family accepted, the marriage was on. The ceremony itself was often simple, more of a public acknowledgement than a religious rite. The couple might simply move into a new tipi together, often one made and gifted by the bride's female relatives. What about consent? A woman technically had a say. A father who forced his daughter into a marriage she adamantly opposed would be seen as tyrannical and might lose face in the community. However, family pressure was immense. A good match could bring wealth, status, and important alliances to her entire family. Refusing such a match was not a decision to be taken lightly. And then there's polygyny, the practice of a man having multiple wives. This is a concept that modern Western minds often struggle with. In the context of plains society, it was a practical and often desirable arrangement. Warfare and dangerous hunts meant that there were often more women than men. Polygyny ensured that every woman had a household, a provider, and a place in society. The most common and preferred form was sororal polygyny, where a man married two or more sisters. This made a huge amount of practical sense. Sisters who had grown up together were more likely to get along, cooperate in the massive amount of work required to run a household, and raise their children together harmoniously. Sometimes, if a married man's wife died, it was considered his duty to marry her unmarried sister to maintain the family alliance and provide for her. It was a social safety net. Finally, let's talk about divorce. If a marriage wasn't working out, getting out of it was shockingly simple, especially for the woman. There were no courts, no lawyers, no paperwork. If a woman wanted a divorce, she could simply place her husband's belongings, his backrest, his weapons, his sacred bundle outside the tipi door. Message sent, message received. The marriage was over. She kept the tipi, the household goods, and usually the children, especially when they were young. A man could also divorce his wife, typically for reasons like laziness, infidelity, or failing to have children, but the woman still retained her property. This system, which seems so foreign to us, was brilliantly adapted to their world. It prioritized family alliances, practicality, and community stability. It provided women with significant economic power within the household and a straightforward escape route from a bad marriage. It was a system built not on abstract ideals of romance, but on the pragmatic and respectful partnership required to build a life together on the Great Plains.